Beautiful. It's great to be with you today. We're kicking off a new series called Generous, how generosity helps Arapaho live into the calling that God has for us, as we heard from the kids teaching us today during children's time. Today's story goes right along with that because it's a story that's usually relegated to kids' Sunday school, but it carries with it a powerful message about opening our hands in gratitude and generosity and how that can transform our world and us, releasing love, life, liberation, healing everywhere we go. It's the story of Zacchaeus, which I finally learned how to spell this week. I think. 2 C's, A-E, got it. I think that's the right way. This story has all of the elements of a good kid's lesson. It's got tree climbing in it. It's got being short, which is important for kids and for me as well, too. And it's got a catchy song that goes along with it as well, too. It's no baby shark, but it's pretty good. It goes like this. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. Yeah, you may have heard that before. That's basically what I learned from Zacchaeus, what the word we means, which was very important for me in my life. Because like when the doctor told me when I was a kid that I'd be about 40th percentile for height in my life, I said, I know you're a doctor, but actually the technical term is we. I learned that from Sunday school here. Seriously, this isn't just a children's story, though, although it's important that we teach it there as well. But it's a vibrant, powerful, subversive invitation for all of us, we and not so we, to be a part of bringing goodness and healing to a world that desperately needs it by opening our hands and our hearts generously to help build an abundant future for everyone with seats at the table for all. And that generous spirit, wherever it goes, transforms the world, and it transforms us too. And we see that in the story of Zacchaeus. So we find this story in Luke chapter 19. Jesus and his gang are traveling through and passing through Jericho. And there, the story tells us, was this man named Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector. And if you'd heard this story in the ancient world, back then, when I said chief tax collector, you would have booed loudly and maybe even like thrown a sandal or something too. And you would have been justified because back then Palestine was occupied by the Roman Empire and they worked with local collaborators to collect taxes. And anything those tax collectors could gather above the actual tax rate, they could keep for themselves as profit. It was a system, as you can imagine, rife with corruption, exploitation, and oppression, so you would boo, too. And Zacchaeus was the chief. He was managing the other tax collectors, taking a cut of their ill-gotten gains. He was like middle management of the system, and worthy of a sandal or two. Zacchaeus wasn't just well off. He was well off because he benefited from an unjust and unfair system. And so, what in the world was it about Jesus that intrigued Zacchaeus? Because Jesus, you may have heard, had some strong words for those who exploited others, and particularly those who'd gotten rich off of that process. Yet Zacchaeus also knew that in Jesus' circle of friends was a former tax collector that Jesus loved and was kind to when everyone else was throwing shoes. And so on this day, Zacchaeus wanted to see what this was all about. Maybe deep down he was kind of seeking a way out, or a sense of worth that his riches never provided him. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he really liked climbing trees, because that's what happens next. Jesus is passing through, and this wealthy, high-class Zacchaeus scurries up a sycamore tree for a better view of this vagabond preacher. But Jesus spots him and calls out immediately, "Zacchaeus!" And 1,000 heads snap in that direction. All eyes on Z in this moment. And Jesus turns to him and says something stunning. "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down. I must stay at your house today." Jesus invites himself over, I teach my kids, be like Jesus, except don't invite yourself over to people's houses. That one, don't do that one. The crowd was furious in this moment, not because Jesus invited himself over, but because he was going to Zacchaeus' house. In ancient culture, dining with someone meant deep fellowship, like full embrace of this person. And you don't eat with the out crowd, especially not the chief tax collector. But Jesus wasn't condoning injustice. He was, in this moment, taking a chance on the power of generous grace to create space for transformation, even in the middle of the system. Jesus never compromised his message of justice. He saw Zacchaeus for exactly who he was, but he also saw who he truly was and the depth of his soul and the potential of who he could be if he opened up. God's love extends to everyone. Maybe in that moment, Zacchaeus realized that for the very first time. When was the last time anyone had shared a meal with him in his home, extended a little kindness? He was so used to being hated, he forgot he was worthy of love. He forgot that the world could be different. See, when hearts open, when we choose love over fear, humanity over otherness, generosity over scarcity, and grace over all, that choice births creativity and openness, and maybe even the generous possibility of transformation. When everyone else had written Zacchaeus off, Jesus chose generous love, and it opened the door for something new. So the kids' song stops here. This is where it ends. But the real story kind of begins here. After the tree climbing, after the invitation, it begins over brunch at Zacchaeus' house. Everything good begins over brunch, doesn't it? So here they are, over avocado toast. Jesus is sitting with Zacchaeus, someone who's part of this system of oppression. And maybe, just maybe, someone opening up to something new, both and. We don't know their exact conversation, but in this conversation, something shifted. I imagine that Jesus listened first because that's always what he did. And then he starts unpacking in a gentle way the truths he shared everywhere he went. God's solidarity with the marginalized, how God defends the weak and protects the foreigner, how God invites us to pursue mercy and do justice and walk humbly with God and each other, how loving God and loving our neighbor are one and the same. And Jesus told Zacchaeus that he was loved, no doubt, generously, extravagantly, and invited him to imagine a future where he could love his neighbor in the very same way. And Zacchaeus listened. Even if he didn't grasp it all in that moment, he listened. I've always pictured this conversation as kind of a conversation of equals. But in their culture, it was not that. Zacchaeus was powerful, and Jesus was a poor vagabond teacher, a marginalized minority, a refugee son of a laborer from a backwater town, part of the very vulnerable class that was crushed by the system. Zacchaeus, though, listened to him. And when he did, when he chose to stop and listen, he heard in that the whisper of God. And here's this moment where the story stops talking about Zacchaeus and starts talking about me, about my part in the system, and about the voices who speak to me now, my vulnerable neighbors, my fellow children of God, right now in our world, educator friends, immigrant families, trans kids, they're speaking. Am I listening? Can I hear God's whisper in their voices, like Zacchaeus? Richard Rohr says this about generosity. He says, generosity is not a moral decision or a matter of willpower. It's a natural response to seeing things as they truly are. seeing that we are all connected, that our lives are a gift, and that we have more than we need. When I see things as they truly are, can I open my hands? Is that my natural response? Can I open my life? Can I share from my more with those whose lives are a gift? That's exactly what Zacchaeus did. In response to Jesus' radical vision of love in action, Zacchaeus stands up and declares this. He says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor." That's never happened at a brunch that I've been to. Maybe it has for you, but it's incredible. But in this moment, it happened because Zacchaeus was listening and opening, and grace was at work. And he saw that the next right step for him was to use what he had for the community's good, to power down and empower others, to leverage his wealth and privilege for those who needed it the most. But amazingly enough, Zacchaeus doesn't stop there. He goes on and does something even more unbelievable. He says, "And if I have cheated anybody out of anything," and he has, "I will repay back 4 times the amount." Jewish law had the concept of reparations, making amends for wrong, and it meant paying back what was owed plus 20%. But Zacchaeus went way beyond, 4 times the amount, because he realized that it wasn't about legality, it was about generous love, about loving God and neighbor as yourself, about the radical generosity of grace that's extended to us and invites us to extend for each other. The Hebrew word for these acts like reparation is the word tikkun olam, the healing of the world. He wasn't just fulfilling a requirement. His generosity in this moment was taking part in healing relationships, healing community, healing injustice, repairing and reconciling. And so in whatever way he could, it was about being part of the healing of the world. And that was worth everything. And so Jesus looks at this one who listened, who opens, and who acted for tikkun olam and said, "Today, salvation has come to this house." Soteria in Greek, salvation, means healing. On this day, when Zacchaeus opened his hands for the healing of the world, Jesus says, "My friend, healing has come to you." Isn't that how it goes? Isn't that how it goes for us? When in the face of our hurting world, our vulnerable neighbors, our fractured communities, when we stop to listen and rather than closing our hands in scarcity and fear, open up and find a way, whatever way it is, no matter how small it seems, to serve, to act, to support, to give. When we move from paralysis to participation in the healing of the world, it's not just that the world takes a step toward healing, it's us being healed as well. Diana Butler-Bass says that gratitude and its outflow in generosity is inherently relational, connecting self and others and the world in a circle of grace, connecting us, reconnecting what's been broken in an interwoven circle of grace, of giving and receiving, of helping and healing, of grace upon grace, of saving grace that heals the world, and us included. Because of the system that Zacchaeus was a part of, he was so disconnected from his neighbors that the only place he could find refuge was high up in a tree. But God's grace-filled love brought him back down to earth, met him at the table, shifted his perspective to see things as they truly are, reawakened his soul, and invited him to a different way, reconnecting Zacchaeus with his neighbor and himself. And as he took part in healing the world, it healed him too. That's my own story in my life. My own generosity started very small, non-existent. Let's just say there were a lot of overdraft fees in my youthful life. Sometimes it was because there was not enough, but usually it was because I wanted a lot for myself. That's what money was for me. That's what my money was. It was for me. I wasn't a tax collector, but I was a part of this system. And the way I used money was for myself. And so my perspective, my worldview, my relationships with those around me was about as big as me. And I'm we, y'all. So that's not very big. But like many of you along the way, I began to listen to this story that Jesus invites us to. I began to listen to the voices of my neighbor, and I began to hear in that the whisper of God about how I could be a part of transforming not just my life, but our whole community. I saw it first in a church like this one that was using everything it had to do good in the world and for each other. And my perspective and the possibilities I can imagine grew a little bit through that. This church, Arapahoe, I get to see it up close, and so do you. It's this powerful community of people who are sharing in the work of healing the world. Whether it's welcoming kids and youth and helping them know God's love with generous hearts that create space for young people to belong. When we welcome refugees, when we stand together with LGBTQ and ally siblings, with people of color and immigrant and native born, we're not just being inclusive, although that is something. We are participating in God's work of repair and restoration, of healing the world. Y'all, even our pumpkin patch is there to support mission and justice work, to be a part of healing the world and our community and beyond, one gourd at a time. And as a result, we are being healed as well. I am. I'm being healed through this. My faith in church is being healed through you, through us, through grace at work in us together. We often hear that, how often healing is what is experienced in this community, and it's true. We are not perfect, but it truly is because we try our best to listen and to respond and to work for the healing of each other and our world in all things, because we keep choosing to try to open our hands. Healing can be found in this house too. This next season together will call us to that work in new ways. As we grow and as the need in our world for a place like this grows, there will be the invitation to listen deeper, to love fuller, and to open our hands wider together. And I'm ready for that. I'm ready to grow with you. Because what I have learned about living generously is that it's not about giving until it hurts. It's about giving so that we can heal our world and ourselves. For me, when I started being a part of that, living generously and giving regularly to support justice and community work, my world grew so much bigger than just me. Which isn't saying much. It's not hard to get bigger than me. But it also says so much about how God is at work. Because as I've continued on my journey, my generosity has grown, and so has my perspective and my soul and myself and my healing as well. Generosity isn't about pressure or guilt. We don't do that here. Jesus didn't do that with Zacchaeus. It was simply an invitation in whatever way you are being called to take that next step in God's transformative work. Through this church or through the many places making a difference in this world is an invitation to open up, to climb down from the trees that keep us separated and take our part in the work of healing. It's what God has always been about, the healing of the world and us. And generosity is one of those foundational ways that we participate. We see it in Zacchaeus. When he climbed down, he wasn't just changing his allocation of charitable contributions. He was stepping into a completely new way of being in the world. His generosity transformed his relationship with his neighbors. It reconnected his community, and it gave him purpose. It healed the world, and it healed him. Friends, that's our invitation as well. To see who we are and what we have to offer, not as things to keep for ourselves, but as tools for healing. To listen to the voices of our neighbors, and to listen in those voices for the whisper of God. And to see our church together not just as a place that we attend, but as a movement of God's healing love that we fuel when we open our hands. Every time we climb down from whatever tree has kept us separated and say yes to the God whose dream is of a world where everyone belongs, where justice rolls down like water, where love leads to action. Every time we respond to our Zacchaeus moment, our invitation to be part of something bigger than ourselves, we get to take part in the transformative work for the healing of the world. So what are we being invited to? What am I being invited to? Whatever it is, just like Zacchaeus, know that God sees you, God loves you, and God invites you to a new way of life. Together, we can create spaces where lives are changed, where justice takes root, where love becomes real, and where we all can experience the justice, the joy, the freedom, and liberation that comes when we open our hands and our hearts in generous, gracious love. And together, friends, we can be part of healing the world, ourselves included. May it be so here at Arapahoe and in all the world. Amen.